welcome everybody tonight to Tell Me About It Tuesday. This is Sound River's monthly virtual science series that we've been doing for quite some time now to stay connected and to update everybody on some of the current research being done in the watersheds. Tonight, we're very excited to have Dr. Stephen Moysey, Professor of Geological Sciences and Director of the Water Resources Center at Eastern Carolina University. He's originally from Canada, where he completed a BS in Environmental Physical Science at the University of Alberta, prior to completing an MS in Hydrology and Water Resources at the University of Arizona. And he did his PhD in Environmental Engineering and Earth Sciences at Clemson. Nope, that's wrong. Stanford. My bad. Before arriving at ECU, he was at Clemson as an environmental engineering and earth sciences professor. His research focuses on using innovative sensing and imaging technologies to understand water flow and chemical transport in soils and groundwater. And he also does research in geoscience education, ranging from developing virtual reality experiences and video games as teaching tools to developing innovative models for student engagement with communities. Tonight, he's going to be talking about his latest research project focused on Eastern North Carolina, coastlines and people, and understanding the opportunities and barriers to climate resilience at a regional scale. Thank you so much, Stephen, for being here tonight. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jill. I'll just share my screen. And hopefully you guys can see that all right. So thanks so much, Jill. First of all, I just want to ask everybody if you could all take just a moment as you're listening to me introduce here to go to the website polev.com/superstone502. I'm going to ask you to do is actually participate in this talk. Even though we're all separate, I think it's a great opportunity for us to try and pull together and participate and get some input as we go along through the discussion tonight. So I'm really glad to be able to be here to share with you this new project of this Coastlines and People project in Eastern North Carolina. It's a new grant that we've gotten with the National Science Foundation. It's really focused on thinking about how are our communities at a broad scale across the watershed focused on dealing with resilience in the face of issues like climate change, and how do we really work together to address those problems. I am by no means, Jill kind of introduced this as my new project, and by no means is that the case. This is a project with very many people involved in it at 7 different universities, and everyone is really bringing a wide range of expertise to this. So I'm going to try and do my best to give just a quick kind of non-technical overview about what this project is all about, and kind of give people a sense of where we're going. But certainly I'd encourage others to, especially if you're on the team and happen to be here when we get to the questions, jump in, because this is very much a team project. So I wanted to start out with just getting you guys accustomed to using this interface. So I can see 4 people have replied so far. So if you haven't yet, jump on that website, polev.com/superstone502, and put a response into this question about how do you feel about the state of our environment in Eastern North Carolina. And I'm a little sad to see people feel sad on the sad side of the spectrum about where we're at. But I do want people to definitely engage and get into the survey, because as we go through, I'm going to ask you for some other input and discuss that as we go through. I really want to take this talk as an opportunity to have a conversation. So I actually want to go ahead and move forward with the next question I want you guys to address, which is, what environmental resources do we value in Eastern North Carolina? And I think there's probably going to be quite a lot of different responses to this in terms of what people think is important. We might be thinking about, the tourism industry and the value our beaches bring to that and the Outer Banks, or of course, many of us, right, have being here at a Sound Rivers talk, care a lot about our rivers and the quality that we face in them and the value they bring to us for recreation and so forth. Um, or certainly we also think about, the diversity of the, the biodiversity we face in our region and what that means to us, or for example, the cultural and recreational value that our rivers and waters bring to us. So if you haven't gotten a chance to go and add into that poll, I'd ask you to do so, or I can just keep talking. But I definitely would prefer to hear what people have to say in terms of seeing what kind of things you guys value. When you put in a response to that poll, you can actually go in and then also kind of upvote other people's responses that you think were important or good. And so these are some of the responses that people are coming in so far. So I value the rivers and all the tributaries and the diversity brings to the state. I'm sad to see places like Lake Madawaskete losing all the SAV, or subaquatic vegetation. Wetlands protection from flooding, recreation and fishing, bird migration, nesting sites, kayaking launches, fish resources, water recreation, fishable, swimmable, drinkable waters, right? I think these are all important things that everybody is bringing up in this poll and starting to share. And I think if you think about these, this is very much kind of these responses that we're getting and that people are sharing are bringing kind of, I would say, one type of perspective in terms of the value of our environment in North Carolina, right? In our project, we're really trying to take a diverse view of all the different stakeholders that utilize the watershed and find value in the environment. And frankly, there is a pretty broad range of stakeholders that we need to be thinking about, right? While we might really be thinking about just that preservation of the natural system, or the biodiversity, the ecosystem side of things, and that is a critical base, right? When it comes to management of our watershed at a large scale, we really need to be taking into account all the values that different stakeholders are bringing so that we can start to think about how might we approach management type scenarios or solutions to some of these kinds of problems we're going to be facing going on in the future. So I'd say that's one of the first things that's an important part of our project, is looking at a watershed scale from the uplands of the watershed where the river starts all the way down to the sound and the outer banks, and thinking across that entire spectrum. But the next question I'd like you to think about, and I'll advance it here, is what threatens these valuable resources that you were just identifying and think about. So I want you to go in and start to add as many possible things that you can think about that may be threats to these natural ecosystems, or just issues that impact our stakeholders across this entire region. And again, feel free, if you like other people's inputs that they're putting in, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. I've added a few things here, just images to help us think about some of the different things that impact our waterways and that we might care about. This first one on the left being actually a discharge happening from a hog farm, where there's a waste lagoon and contributing quite a lot of nutrients into the waterways. Flood issues, right, that are whether it's near the coastline with storm surge type issues, or riparian flooding around the river that's impacting our infrastructure, as well as contributing to washing off or release of different kinds of contaminants into our waterways. And of course, impacts we may face from those, such as impacts on our natural ecosystems, fish kills, and so forth, all the way to thinking about impacts of infrastructure. So the picture on the right is actually the boardwalk at Goose Creek State Park. So let's see some of the things you guys have come up with. So a wide range of things, right? Development, saltwater intrusion, agricultural runoff, bad farming discharges, detergents, lack of enforcement of existing rules and laws, development, sea level rise, climate change, bad legislation. I think all of these things are important factors, right? And I think that one thing that someone put in there with development and sea level rise, I think for a lot of the other problems, those are real driving factors that are behind all these other impacts that people are naming off here. And so for our project, those are three definitely major issues that we're concerned about in terms of impacting the resilience of our region and what it means for us in terms of being sustainable into the future. And so in the project, while those are three major motivators or drivers, I would say, oops, the two major factors that we're really looking at, or issues, are flood risks and the water quality of our waters, and in particular, the estuary. And on the kind of traditional environmental science side of what we're trying to do in this project, we're really looking at three kinds of underlying environmental issues. So one being the idea of thresholds, or who's actually contributing to the risk of these issues of flood or water quality issues, and who might need to participate in conservation practices, because maybe not everybody is contributing in the same way. And it might be important to really know who are the primary people that or areas that need to be more engaged in protection practices. Time lag. So when we do have an issue, an event, a release, whatever it happens to be, how long does it take to actually observe a change in response in our watershed? And so understanding kind of the propagation of whether it's water or contaminants and how long that will stay and linger in our environment is a second important issue we're trying to look at in the watershed. And the third one is then really thinking about some of these stressors, right? In terms of what impact is sea level rise or extreme weather going to have in the future as we continue to see change in our environment. So trying to understand those kinds of problems within our watershed means we really have to have a fairly good understanding of what are the different responses that we're seeing. And so we're looking at the watershed as a whole. And so this is just an image of the entire watershed to give people a sense of the scale of the project. And because our project is really focused on this issue of thinking about resilience and community participation and decision-making in that process, we have a variety of communities that we're really focused on working with in the project that span kind of different types of settings across the watershed, different types of settings and time in terms of the environment that they're at, but also in terms of the social and economic kinds of conditions that they face. So the five primary areas we're focused in right now are Princeville, Greenville, Aurora within Hyde County, and Nags Head overall. So this map was really just to kind of show that overall sense of where we're working. Some of these dots are showing places where we have data that are available from the state or other agencies that are available to help inform our understanding of processes. And a lot of that is, in kind of the western part of the watershed. As we get out east, we're actually not really having a lot. Some of these orange and yellow and purple kinds of dots are actually stations that we had proposed that we should start to look at and collect more information about. Of course, we're missing some things like the Ferrymon program and so forth, but for the most part, once we move to the east, we're really lacking in a lot of data. And so that's one of the things we're doing in this project, is really trying to focus on collecting more data to better understand what these processes are, environmental processes are, in terms of the release, the time lags, and the stressors, how they'll impact change over time. And so we have currently on this project 39 sites where we're going around and collecting monthly samples. That's actually been a great partnership we've been working with Sound Rivers on in terms of helping to support the swim guide to some degree. And that will be something we're continuing on throughout the winter. So even when the swim guide project shuts down, we'll still keep collecting data at those sites to understand more about change throughout the year. We're also putting out water quality probes to monitor continuously changes in the estuary and rivers over time, as well as about 20 watershed monitoring stages to understand flows and the salinity changes or the electrical conductivity at those sites over time. All of this data together, we're actually pulling together certainly to help us understand some of these environmental processes. But we're also working with North Carolina Central University, and one of the primary things they're doing on the project is actually trying to pull all of this data together into one coherent kind of system that can be designed in a way to share that data with the broader community. And so we're really working to have a community data portal that will have different types of interfaces for community members, for maybe more engineering type folks or regulatory folks and so forth, to really think about how do we share these different kinds of information in a way that's relevant to all different kinds of community members. So the third question I have for you is, what kinds of barriers, in terms of all the things you guys just identified earlier in terms of threats, what are some of the barriers that we might face as a region or a state in trying to address these different kinds of threats? So go ahead and start answering in your responses, and the poll should be open. And I'll share that kind of what everyone's responding with in a second. But as people go and add their responses to that poll, I'll share a little bit about why I put these different images on this particular slide, because I think it really shows a lot of different types of issues that we might be concerned with or care about. So that figure on the right, the reason why I included that actually is this condemned house out on the beach in the Outer Banks, where it's condemned because it can't meet regulatory limits for septic systems, right? But the house is still there because that person is waiting for beach nourishment to come back and create the place where they can go and actually have that be a viable house again. And so what that makes me think about are, what are some of the regulatory issues that we actually have or have put in place that might be things that make people make decisions that seem kind of strange. That second picture is an image of a ditch or a canal out in the peninsula. And the reason I included that one here is to think about all of those many ditches that we have all over the peninsula in eastern North Carolina that are really conduits, ideally, to drain the land, but they're also conduits for salt water coming into all these agricultural regions within that part of the state. And so really that kind of infrastructure that was built for one purpose is now causing other kinds of purposes. That's potentially another type of barrier we might have. Hog farms or kind of corporate industries might be another barrier in terms of not only being kind of a lobby or a group that might be opposed or thinking about issues, but I think the bigger thing there is, in reality, right, a lot of people are depending on these kinds of industries to support themselves and so forth. And so that alone, right, how do we support our economy in North Carolina is an important thing to be thinking about, even if we don't always like what the outputs of some of those things are. We need to really understand, what are the contributions and what are the options for solutions so that we still are having economic supports for people. And then finally, of course, we might have different kinds of engineered infrastructure that's been built in for a long time. And maybe it's time to be thinking about, how do we change, or how do we go to different kinds of solutions, such as ecologically based solutions to deal with issues. So let me go forward to your responses, because there's a lot over here. And so, oh, it's interesting because I know there's a lot more than that up there. So I don't know why it hasn't updated on my screen here in this presentation, but let me just read out some of these things. Old existing infrastructure, education about threats, lack of statewide water plans, lack of geographic area and, or excuse me, a large geographic area and competing interests, rebuilding in the floodplains, economic interest versus the environment, enforcement money, lack of awareness, apathy, climate change impacts will only get worse, attracting the attention of state and local governments, moneyed interests, policy, I see up there a couple times. And so I think all of those things are really important issues, right, that we need to face and try and deal with in trying to overcome these issues. And I think in particular, policy is one of the areas that is an interesting thing to think about as a barrier to how we can protect our region or how we can become more resilient as a whole within Eastern North Carolina. And so in particular on our project, so we kind of have the environmental side and monitoring with monitoring and computer modeling and so forth. But then we also have a social science part of this project that's focused on trying to understand more about what are the different types of approaches that might be good solutions for dealing with some of these problems. And so one of the things we're interested in is, in the traditional sense, people really live in a context of whatever environmental attitudes they have, whatever economic realities and incentives they face, that either maybe allow them to become contributors to some of these environmental impacts that we're concerned about, or they may be impacted by these people. And so a lot of times what we do is put in place policies, programs, and penalties across the board, right, as a region or a state, to apply to everybody in a very kind of uniform type of way. And one potential issue with that is, what if we actually have different types of communities that are present in our region? And so, for example, perhaps we have some vulnerable communities who are maybe low income or otherwise not included in decision-making processes, so that they can speak up and talk about, what are the potential impacts of these regulatory pathways on them. And I think those vulnerable communities could fall on either side of either the contributing population or the impacted population to cause potential harm to them. So for example, we all know or are pretty aware that in general, sanitary sewer overflows are an issue in terms of release of nutrients to our rivers and estuary. Things like septic tanks, likewise, right, releasing these nutrients. But obviously for people who are maybe relying on things like a safe estuary to go fishing and you are using those fish as a food source, they're going to be very impacted, right? Especially if, say, an algal bloom happens and it is killing off all of the fish in the end. So there are certain obvious impacts on that impacted community. But at the same time, right, if that community who's maybe a small community doesn't have the resources or the infrastructure to really be dealing with, say, a regulatory change that would come in and impact everybody universally, right? Maybe they don't have, maybe they're going to be impacted in a much more negative way than a community, that has a lot of resources and funding and tax base to deal with those kinds of things. And so for us, one of the things that we're very interested in our project is environmental justice issues on both sides of this decision-making kind of paradigm. And so, in general, just in a very brief sense, right, environmental justice is all about the fair treatment and involvement for all in decision-making processes. And so, as opposed to this traditional kind of regulatory pathway, the other thing we're thinking about on our project are there other cooperative or social kind of pathways that could be used that can be more tailored to allow different kinds of communities, whether they're contributors or being impacted by some of these watershed impacts, how can they actually maybe start to cooperate and find solutions that are more tailored made for those particular kinds of situations? And so a lot of the social scientists on our team are thinking about not only the environmental attitudes, the economic setting or incentives that impact people, but also how other factors like perceived control in decision making and that what you do actually makes a difference, or your trust in different communities, different agencies or institutions, how people identify with the environment, or kind of what the social norms are. How do all of those things potentially impact our ability to operate not only as a single community within one particular local area, but also how can multiple communities start to collaborate with each other to address these problems? And so obviously, so that's kind of from a social science research perspective, they're interested in those issues, but we're also interested in this project. About half of the project is kind of focused on these environmental monitoring, these social science kinds of issues. But the other half is really focused on, well, how do we actually build that opportunity to bring people together to create that culture and change in our region so that people are really collaborating together in a way. So how are we giving people that opportunity for involvement in decision making, whoever they are? And so I think for us, there's different ways of thinking about how can we engage the public, at large, as experts in the environment. And so certainly one opportunity would be for people to go in and say, we want to talk with the community in a public forum kind of setting and get information from you to kind of help inform the decision making that's going to happen. But of course, in that kind of a setting, right, the information transfer is really one way. And so the expert may take this information, but there's still no participation by everybody else in the actual decision making process. In contrast, the experts may say, well, what we really need is for people to understand these issues more. We need to do more environmental education. And so they may be deciding, here's the stuff you need to know as a public to get out there and make better, more informed decisions. But again, that's not necessarily going to be addressing the public in terms of engaging them as participants. It's more kind of informing them sometimes. Citizen science, right, is an opportunity to get people more involved, right, to get hands-on, to bring people out. I think the swim guide is an excellent example of a citizen science project where people can get involved and participate in understanding and collecting the data that helps us understand what the risks and issues are. But even in this case, one of the issues is that, as a participant, you're still not really defining what those questions are. The expert, in that case, maybe Sound Rivers, is deciding, here's the question we want to answer. And then people are getting involved in that and participating in the collection of the data, but not really deciding what that question was in the first place. And so for us, what we're really trying to do on this project is take a community-based participatory research approach where we're really coming at things together jointly as bringing together the experts and the public to develop what those questions are in the first place, and then pursue them together in a joint and collaborative kind of a way. And we really think that this is an important kind of thing to do and able to help build that opportunity for communities as a whole to define what are the questions that are important to them in their local context and how to then connect those across the broader watershed. And so we have a variety of programs, really 4 main things we're trying to implement in this project to try and really get at and engage the communities in participating in these things and really deciding what the science is that should be going on in their particular context and setting. If you're interested in learning more about them, there's a website there. I definitely suggest you go and check that out, water.ecu.edu. We'll take you to the Water Resources Center webpage at ECU. You can go to the Get Involved menu option, or you can go to this long website, water.ecu.edu/cope/community science. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about these 4 programs and what we're trying to do with each of those. So the first one is what we're calling the Community Water Course Program. And the idea behind this is really building community science groups in different community settings. And right now we're collaborating with Princeville, Greenville, Aurora, and Nags Head in establishing these groups this summer to get them started up. The idea here is really to get people involved in understanding, the tools and process of science, whether that might be things like geographic information systems or GIS mapping tools, or water quality sampling, or survey survey instruments and tools to learn more about their own communities, right? We're really focused on how do we bring people together to get the tools to do science to support them. We're doing this very much in a collaborative way where we're working in partnership with those community groups to help support and enable them. And so we say it's a guided hands-on group science program because we're really focused on not just dropping people in and say, go out for it, but really trying to help make sure that they have those tools and resources that they need. Since we're just getting started this summer, one of the things we're really kind of focusing people on are tools to help them understand the community and the needs of the community right now as kind of a starting point in that process. So these groups will be meeting with local community leadership and so forth to define these. For this year, we're really focused, we saw kind of the best opportunity to start building these groups, and some of the interest brought up by the communities was really focused on youth development. So for this year, we're really focused on bringing in middle and high school aged participants to these groups and getting them really involved. But over time, we really hope that that broadens out to the greater community. As we go forward, though, with these groups, it's not just them deciding the science. We are really working so that what happens is as these community science groups are working on questions and problems and issues, they're reporting back all the time to the broader community. So we're working with the communities to have broader community outreach events where these groups will report back to the community. And through those outreach events, we'll also be working to define what are the priorities of the communities and what are the science interests to feed back in to what those local science groups are really working on and doing. So we see this as a really key component of what we're trying to do to build this cycle where we bring people in to always be kind of bringing up new questions of relevance to each particular community and look at that as hopefully a sustainable model to continue building community science in each region over time. The second big thing we're trying to do, there may be some cases where an individual in a community has some real passion or burning interest or sees a problem that they've always wanted to solve. And it may be beyond, what could be covered by this community water course program. So the other thing we're starting out, and we're just doing a pilot right now and hoping and planning to launch this program kind of more broadly in the fall, is to build a program we're calling People for Environmental Equity in Residence, or a PEER program. We call it an in-residence program because what we're trying to do is give everyday community members the opportunity to actually have a formal position with the university that provides them access to the resources of the university. So we're helping with providing, science mentorship to help define, a particular approach that someone might be interested in taking to solve a concern they have or develop a program they're interested in. They'll have opportunities to collaborate with experts at the university on a variety, whatever topic it is they're interested in. They'll get access to tools and technologies at the university. They'll have students available and accessible to help them to put forward that activity that they want to pursue, and will help provide them funding to get there and connect them to local or state kind of leadership to help promote that. So we're pretty excited about the idea of this, of how we can get the community, not just how can the university go to the community and work with the community, but how can the community really come in and become a part of the university to drive more of what the interests how the interests of the community are getting embedded within the activities of the university itself. So, and then the third major thing we're doing is really thinking about how do we go beyond the individual communities or individual programs so that we can all start to learn from each other as we work in all these different communities across the watershed. And so, we've been calling it an environmental justice retreat, but really I see this as a big event to bring people together from across the watershed to build understanding of what the issues are across the watershed, have discussions about what are possible solutions or strategies we might start to take to help each other, to learn from each other. We definitely will be having kind of formal presentations such as poster sessions where those community groups will be sharing the science and what they've been learning along with others. But also we want it to have very much like a festival kind of atmosphere as well, where the public can come and get engaged and have a chance to have hands-on experiences, get some training if they're interested in it, engage with different community groups, and just have some fun with everybody too. So that's something, if you're interested in, we're in the process of getting organized. And so if you are a community group such as Sound Rivers, you will be expecting to hear from us soon to actually start getting that all set up. But we're planning August 6th is the date for that for this year. And then we'll continue that on an annual kind of basis. So those are kind of just a broad overview of what this project is all about. And so I hope I was at least able to communicate to you some of these issues in terms of, how do we think about what we value? How do we start to approach trying to address protecting those values as we face issues with climate change and sea level rise and so forth through science, monitoring, watershed modeling and so forth. Some of these social science approaches to decision making and how to get people engaged, all the way through to really having the community be a much broader and more intrinsic part of what's going on. And our real hope is that over time, the things that we might be doing in academic research start to merge and blend with those things that are of real primary interest to communities so that we can grow that network or partnership over time for a much more sustainable and resilient kind of future. So I'll end there, but with my final question for you, if you've been on the surveys, my question for you is, if you want to learn more or you see any opportunities or challenges that you're aware of that you think our project team should be aware of, feel free to go in and add it to that poll now, give us a little shout out, or feel free to send us an email at water@ecu.edu. So thank you all for your time, and I hope that was an okay introduction to what we're trying to do through that program.
Awesome. Thanks, Stephen. That was really interesting to hear the project and a really big overview of what y'all are trying to do. Does anybody, I don't know if there's any questions in the chat before I jump in with questions. Does anybody want to come off of mute and ask anything of our presenter tonight? I'll let everybody mull it over and I'll throw the first one out there. So the 4 locations that you're going to be focusing on, Princeville, Greenville, Aurora, and Nags Head. Could you talk a little bit about why you chose those locations and what you maybe expect to see there, or just just the differences between those 4 spots?
Yeah, so there's multiple reasons, but basically I think it comes down to environmental differences and kind of the socioeconomic differences, right? So as, for example, if we look at a community like Princeville, they're really facing a lot of flood issues, right? That's a major concern in Princeville. That's a different kind of concern to people down say in Nags Head, right? It's not the same kind of issue. But those two communities also have very different kind of socioeconomic status. They have different income levels. They have different kinds of power differentials in the state, right, in terms of what they're contributing and how they might be participating in these broader kinds of decision-making strategies. And so, for both of those kinds of reasons, we've selected the communities, right? So Princeville is a very small, unique kind of community in just the traditional riparian watershed facing flood issues. Greenville, right, internally within the city itself, there's a lot of differences in terms of socioeconomic differences throughout the city. And for example, north of the river is much more subject to flood issues than other parts of the city. There's issues around, certainly stormwater issues in the city, right? Going down to Aurora, completely different kind of environment again, right? Kind of more on the estuary, some of these saltwater issues. Obviously, the mine out there is another, phosphate mine is another potential issue. So really, it's all of these different, we wanted to have a very different mix of what the communities were like and kind of the challenges they were facing. And in part, that's really to come back to how are people going to have opportunities to talk with each other and learn from each other, especially when they have such different perspectives.
Floor is still open if anybody wants to unmute and ask a question. Otherwise, I'm going to keep going.
I do have a question. The purpose, the goal of this project seems to be like real community engagement with resiliency, as far as resiliency is concerned. Is there sort of like a timeline where y'all hope to mesh the people who are being affected as opposed to the policy that's being created?
Yeah. I thought that was going to be an easy question, and then you made it a complicated, difficult question. So the project itself is five years, and I think within that 5-year time frame, we certainly hope to mesh. We certainly hope that we're going to be able to help build a network of people, right? Communities, academics, organizations that are really collaborating in real meaningful way to develop solutions. I think your question though turned into, how long, what's the time frame for creating the policy changes that, cause change or impacts for people? And I think that's a very, very different question that I think would be very difficult to answer. Actually, I'm not even sure how to approach answering that question. Just because it's so much about what does it take to go to that next policy stage, right? What does it take, like the political will, there's so many other factors to actually change, even with the communities working together and being interested to go to that next step of policy change. I don't know.
Sorry for that. I do have another question from John Crystal down in Pamlico Beach. Is the Aurora site at Aurora or along South Creek or at the Pamlico River? Okay, that's something that we can actually. Okay, so which site are we talking about down there?
So the town of Aurora. So we're actually based, the program that we're going to be working with the community with is going to be based out of the Aurora Fossil Museum. That's kind of like the host site.
I'll jump in here and give everybody else a moment. So as I was butchering your credentials at the start of this, Stephen, you have clearly like a lot of background in pretty like hard sciences. But a lot of this project is very social science, community engagement focused and trying to really recognize how environmental justice and disparities between communities plays a big role and will continue to play a big role in resiliency efforts. Could you talk about like how you got interested sort of like in this side of the world and this side of research? And yeah, I'm just interested in sort of like an environmental engineer and hydrologist, and is interested in pursuing research and really focusing on community engagement.
Yeah, so for me, I think really where it comes from. So when I'll go back to when I was an undergrad, and as an undergrad, I really wasn't sure what to do. I wanted to do actually until I took a class by someone about water resources in developing countries, and that just got me completely interested in hydrology. And even at that point, when I graduated, I had a very difficult decision about, did I want to go to one university and pursue a master's degree in international development because I was really interested in that activity, or did I want to go to University of Arizona, which at the time and maybe still is kind of like the best school for hydrology in the world? And so I was like, well, there's a lot of people kind of going out and doing that development kind of work from a social science kind of background. And I thought, if I want to get involved with that, maybe the best way I can make an impact is by going and doing more of the hard science. And so that actually took me down that path to Arizona. And then I ended up getting a PhD in geophysics. This is my actual PhD, which I never would have anticipated. But as soon as I got my PhD and I got my faculty position at Clemson, one of the first things I did actually was I got on a plane and I went to India and met up with a friend that I went to Stanford with, and he went back to start an NGO. And so he took me around and introduced me to a bunch of different NGOs, and I started a project in India working with villagers and working on water sustainability issues. And so from that, that was definitely, I was excited. That was an opportunity to pursue that long-term kind of an interest. But I have to say, working on that project, I worked on it for about 5 or 6 years. And I started to think about the fact, especially coming to Eastern North Carolina, we got a lot of issues here. Like, why am I going to India to solve their problems when we have similar kinds of issues here? And so I kind of almost see this as, following up on that long-term international development interest, but doing it here with our own people in a place where we can really make an impact locally. And so that was probably a much longer answer to your question than you wanted, but I think that's kind of the history of how I got here with that interest.
I appreciate all that background for sure. John just put something into the chat. I know Carl Crozier, he was on earlier, but I think he must have dropped off. But is there any overlap with this work with NC State Extension?
Yeah, so we actually are doing work. So I wouldn't say there's immediate direct overlap, but there's certainly overlap in topics and issues. So for example, we're doing work looking at soil salinization in some of the different areas of the state. And that's an area I know Carl was involved with and working on somewhat. And so that's, certainly of interest in our project. When we think about all of these different stakeholders and diverse needs and opinions, right? That is one of them. Thinking about how farmers are going to be adapting or what they're going to do in the future is certainly, I think one of those examples of overlap.
Thank you.
Awesome. I know we're a few minutes before 8. We always try to wrap up by 8 o'clock. As I'm closing us out here, if you have any last minute burning questions, feel free to unmute and interrupt me or throw them in the chat. But just want to say thank you again to you, Stephen, for being here tonight and giving us an overview of some pretty exciting upcoming research throughout the watershed. And thanks to everybody else for attending tonight. We're going to be taking a summer hiatus from Tell Me About It Tuesday. We're hoping that people will be able to be outside and not in front of a computer screen more often. So we'll be taking a hiatus. So this is the last one for this spring, and it will be reposted on our Facebook page. And we'll be sure to include some of the links that Stephen had related to this project and how to provide input and get involved. So thank you all for being here, and we will see you next time.